The year was 79 AD, and beneath the marble corridors of Rome's greatest monument to power, something unspeakable was about to unfold. In the suffocating darkness of underground holding cells, captured women from conquered territories waited in chains, unaware that their suffering would become entertainment for 50,000 cheering Romans above. What happened to these prisoners after the crowds went home represents one of history's most systematically covered up practices, a ritual so vicious that even Rome's own senators would eventually be forced to address it in emergency session. Today, we're peeling back 2,000 years of sanitized history to expose the horrifying reality behind gladiator victories. This isn't the romanticized version Hollywood feeds us. This is the documented truth that Roman historians deliberately obscured, the archaeological evidence that modern excavations have finally brought to light, and the bureaucratic records that reveal how an empire turned human dignity into a reward system for killers. Before we dive into this nightmare, hit that subscribe button, because once you understand what really happened in ancient Rome, you'll never look at those marble statues and tourist attractions the same way again. Comment below whether you think confronting these historical horrors is necessary for understanding civilization, or if some truths are too dark to examine. What you're about to discover comes directly from recently translated Senate documents, archaeological findings beneath the Colosseum, and witness accounts that survived Rome's systematic attempt to erase this evidence from history. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena. It was Rome's masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed not merely to entertain but to terrorize conquered peoples into absolute submission. Completed in 80 AD under Emperor Titus, this architectural marvel could hold more spectators than most modern stadiums, its underground chambers engineered with the same precision Romans applied to their aqueducts and roads. But beneath those perfectly fitted stones lay a network of cells, tunnels, and specialized rooms that served purposes far darker than housing wild animals. The sand covering the arena floor wasn't decorative. It was functional, designed to absorb whatever poured from dying fighters and butchered beasts. That sand concealed a complex elevator system capable of lifting entire staged sets, exotic animals, and human cargo from the hypogeum below. Roman engineers had created a machine of spectacle, where life and death became performance art, where the conquered became props in elaborate displays of imperial dominance. When Roman legions crushed rebellions across the empire, they returned with more than gold and territory. They brought people, hundreds of captives from each campaign, carefully categorized by Roman bureaucrats, who treated human beings like inventory. Noble women, priestesses, warriors' wives, and daughters of chieftains found themselves shipped to Rome in chains, destined for fates they couldn't imagine in their worst nightmares. These weren't random prisoners. Rome deliberately selected women who represented something sacred or powerful in their original cultures. Temple priestesses who had served their gods for decades, daughters of kings who had once commanded respect and protection, wives of warriors who had died defending their homelands. The empire understood that breaking these symbolic figures would send a message more powerful than any military victory. Resistance was not just futile, it was an invitation to complete annihilation of everything a people held sacred. The gladiator system that Romans celebrated as the pinnacle of martial entertainment was built on human slavery and sustained by constant warfare. Men like Gaius Valerius Maximus, whose story we'll follow today, were typically debt slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals condemned to die for the amusement of crowds. They fought not for glory, but for the slim chance of survival, knowing that each victory brought them closer to freedom while simultaneously making them complicit in Rome's machinery of death. Maximus had survived 14 years in the arena, an almost impossible feat in a profession where most fighters died within their first year. His body bore the scars of 89 documented kills, each one recorded by arena scribes who maintained meticulous statistics for betting purposes and imperial records. He had watched friends die on the sand, seen wild animals tear apart unarmed prisoners, and participated in stage battles where the outcome was predetermined, but the blood was real. The reward system for gladiator victories followed protocols established by generations of Roman administrators. Winners received money, food, better quarters, and what the official documents called spoils of conquest. This last category included something Roman law explicitly permitted, but historians rarely discussed in detail. Victorious gladiators could claim female prisoners as personal rewards, a practice so normalized that arena officials maintained specialized facilities to accommodate it. On that August afternoon in 79 AD, when Maximus defeated a Dacian champion in front of Emperor Titus himself, he earned the right to choose from among 18 captured women. These prisoners had been prepared according to standard procedures, bathed and clothed in simple tunics, their names recorded on bronze tablets for administrative purposes. Among them stood a young woman named Sabina, whose world had been destroyed 3 months earlier when Roman legions burned her village and killed her betrothed warrior. The selection process was ceremonial, designed to emphasize the victor's power and the captive's helplessness. Maximus walked among the chained women, while an official read their supposed crimes aloud to justify their fate. Rebellion against Rome, aiding enemies of the state, refusing to acknowledge Roman gods. These charges were largely fabricated, designed to provide legal cover for what everyone understood was simply the systematic exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. What made this particular day different wasn't the routine brutality that followed gladiator victories. It was the decision that Maximus would make in the underground chambers, a choice that would expose the entire system to scrutiny and force Rome's Senate to acknowledge practices they had spent decades pretending didn't exist. The preparation of captives followed procedures refined over generations of conquest. Women were separated from men, examined by arena physicians, and classified according to various criteria that determined their ultimate fate. The healthiest and youngest were reserved for gladiator rewards. Others were designated for public execution spectacles, religious sacrifices, or sale to private buyers. Every step was documented, every decision recorded, every human life reduced to bureaucratic categories. The underground complex beneath the arena contained specialized chambers designed specifically for post-victory activities. These weren't improvised spaces, but engineered rooms with drainage systems, restraining devices built into the walls, and doors that locked only from the outside. Archaeological excavations in 2018 revealed these facilities exactly as contemporary accounts described them, complete with bronze identification tags dating to the exact period of the Dacian campaigns. Roman society not only permitted these practices, but celebrated them as natural consequences of military success. Victory entitled the victor to complete dominion over the defeated, including their bodies, their dignity, and their lives. This wasn't seen as cruelty, but as the proper order of things, the way the universe rewarded strength and punished weakness. Roman philosophers wrote extensively about the justice of conquest, the natural hierarchy that placed Romans above all other peoples, and the moral duty to civilize barbarians through domination. The crowds that filled the Colosseum understood exactly what their cheers enabled. They weren't innocent spectators, but active participants in a system that transformed human suffering into entertainment. Vendors sold food and wine to families who brought children to watch people die. Wealthy matrons placed bets on which prisoners would survive the longest under torture. Senators used gladiator games to curry political favor, knowing that providing spectacular brutality would earn them votes and social standing. The bureaucracy supporting these spectacles was vast and efficient. Scribes recorded every detail, from the names of fighters to the disposal of bodies. Architects designed specialized spaces for different types of violence. Trainers developed techniques for prolonging suffering to maximize crowd engagement. Physicians studied methods for keeping victims conscious during extended torture. Rome had industrialized cruelty, turning it into a sophisticated entertainment industry that generated enormous profits for everyone involved. As Maximus descended into the Hypogeum that afternoon, followed by arena officials carrying the bronze tablet listing his earned rewards, neither he nor the empire he served could predict that this routine transaction would spark a crisis, reaching the highest levels of Roman government. The machine of exploitation that had operated smoothly for generations was about to encounter something it wasn't designed to handle: a gladiator who remembered what it meant to be human. The chamber where Sabina waited was identical to dozens of others beneath the arena floor. Stone walls, iron rings embedded at shoulder height, a wooden bench, and a drain cut into the floor. Everything was clean, organized, and terrifying in its obvious purpose. This wasn't a prison cell, but a specialized facility, as carefully designed as any other part of the Colosseum's architecture. The message was clear. What happened here was not aberration, but policy, not chaos, but system, not accident, but intention. The door opened, with a grinding of iron against stone, and Maximus entered the chamber, where his reward awaited him. Still wearing his blood-stained armor from the afternoon's victory, he carried the weight of 14 years in the arena on his shoulders. The woman pressed against the far wall looked nothing like the barbarian, savage Roman propaganda had taught him to expect. She was young, perhaps 19, with the kind of dignity that no amount of chains could strip away. What should have been a straightforward transaction according to Roman custom, instead became something unprecedented. Maximus removed his helmet and set down his gladiators, actions that violated every protocol governing gladiator conduct with captive rewards. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, separating two different concepts of what it meant to be human. When Maximus finally broke that silence, he spoke in broken Dacian, words he had picked up from other prisoners over the years. He asked about the man she had lost, the warrior who had died defending their homeland. Her response came in whispers, but it carried the weight of an entire civilization's grief. She told him about villages burned, children scattered, temples desecrated. She spoke of a people who had lived in harmony with their mountains for centuries, now reduced to entertainment for an empire that measured success in screams and submission. Something extraordinary happened in that underground chamber. Two people who should have been natural enemies according to Roman ideology discovered their shared humanity. Maximus told her about his own losses, how debt had destroyed his family and condemned him to a life of killing for the amusement of crowds. She listened without judgment, recognizing in his scarred face the same defeat that lived in her own eyes. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, though neither would have been able to measure time in that windowless space. They spoke about their gods, their dreams, their fears. Maximus described the recurring nightmare that had haunted him since his first kill in the arena. She shared memories of festivals in her mountain village, celebrations that would never happen again because there was no one left to remember them. Guards checked twice during those hours, hearing voices through the door and assuming compliance with standard procedures. They had no reason to suspect that instead of exploitation, something resembling redemption was taking place in that stone chamber. The Roman system was so confident in its power to dehumanize both victim and perpetrator that it never considered the possibility of resistance through compassion. As the afternoon wore on, Maximus faced a choice that would define not just his own fate, but expose the moral bankruptcy of the empire he served. He could follow protocol, use his legally granted power, and maintain his position within a system that rewarded brutality. Or he could reject everything Rome had taught him about strength, victory, and the natural order of conquest. The decision he made would reverberate through Senate chambers and force an empire to confront its own monstrosity. At exactly 6 p.m, as shadows lengthened across the arena above, Maximus called for the guard. When the official appeared, expecting to collect a satisfied customer and process the next transaction, he instead encountered something that challenged every assumption about how conquered people should be treated. Maximus declared the woman ill, possibly infected, and formally refused his allocated reward. The lie was transparent, but Roman bureaucracy operated on rigid procedures that prioritized documentation over investigation. Challenging a gladiator's rejection of spoils required paperwork, witness statements, and formal hearings that could take weeks to resolve. Accepting the refusal took mere minutes and avoided administrative complications. The guard, faced with a choice between efficiency and scrutiny, chose the path of least resistance. Sabina was removed from the chamber and transferred to the medical holding area, an overcrowded section of the hypogeum where prisoners awaiting treatment were housed in conditions that made their original cells seem luxurious. The irony was crushing. Maximus had saved her from one horror only to deliver her into another, equally deadly situation. The medical facilities beneath the arena were breeding grounds for disease, staffed by overworked slaves who viewed their patients as inventory rather than human beings. 3 days later, Sabina died from a simple infection that proper medical attention could have prevented. She never saw sunlight again, never breathed free air, never learned that her brief conversation with a gladiator had planted seeds of rebellion that would grow into a crisis, threatening the foundations of Roman entertainment culture. Her death was recorded in the same bureaucratic language that documented grain shipments and road repairs. Another piece of conquered property disposed of according to regulations. Maximus fought twice more that month, winning both bouts with the mechanical efficiency that had kept him alive for 14 years. Each time, he refused his traditional rewards, claiming illness or defects in the offered captives. Word of his behavior spread through the gladiator barracks, like infection through the overcrowded medical wards. Some fighters whispered that he had joined one of the strange Eastern cults, preaching mercy and compassion. Others suggested that Dacian witches had cursed him, stolen his warrior's heart, and replaced it with weakness. The truth was simpler and more dangerous than superstition. Maximus had remembered something Rome worked tirelessly to make its subjects forget. He had recognized the humanity in someone the empire classified as subhuman. That recognition was a virus more threatening to Roman stability than any barbarian army, because it suggested that the entire structure of conquest and exploitation rested on lies that could be exposed by simple human connection. Arena officials initially dismissed Maximus's behavior as temporary madness brought on by too many blows to the head. Gladiators were valuable investments who occasionally required maintenance and adjustment. They increased his training regimen, assigned him additional combat practice, and consulted physicians about possible brain injuries that might explain his sudden reluctance to claim legitimate rewards. But when other fighters began following his example, refusing their own allocated captives and citing his influence, the situation escalated beyond medical concern into political crisis. A junior gladiator named Marcus Brutus Calvus, nephew of a sitting senator, was beaten by his trainer for declining to accept a captured Gallic priestess after a minor victory. The young man claimed that Maximus had shown him a different path, that strength could be measured by mercy rather than domination. The incident forced Rome's ruling class to acknowledge publicly what they had always known privately. The gladiator reward system wasn't just about individual gratification, but about maintaining the psychological foundations of imperial dominance. If fighters began refusing to participate in the ritualized humiliation of conquered peoples, the entire spectacle lost its meaning as a demonstration of Roman superiority over barbarian weakness. Senator Quintus Aurelius Scaurus brought the matter before the full Senate on September 15th, presenting it as a question of military discipline rather than moral philosophy. His nephew's defiance, he argued, represented a dangerous precedent that could undermine the loyalty of Roman forces throughout the empire. if gladiators could refuse legitimate rewards? What prevented legionnaires from questioning orders or governors from rejecting tribute from conquered territories? The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within Roman society about the relationship between power and responsibility. Conservative senators led by Marcus Fabius Quintus argued that tradition justified any treatment of defeated enemies. Their ancestors had built the empire through strength and determination, conquering peoples who would otherwise have remained savage and unproductive. Mercy was weakness, compassion was corruption, and any deviation from established customs represented betrayal of Roman values. Progressive voices, influenced by Stoic philosophy and practical concerns about provincial stability, countered with arguments about long-term imperial interests. Senator Lucius Annius Seneca pointed out that excessive brutality was generating more rebellion than submission across the frontier territories. Dead enemies stayed dead, but traumatized survivors became living symbols of Roman cruelty, inspiring resistance movements that cost more to suppress than the original conquests had yielded in tribute. The true catalyst for legislative action wasn't moral awakening, but political necessity. 3 provincial governors had recently reported increased unrest in their territories, with resistance leaders explicitly citing Roman treatment of captive women as proof that the empire represented existential evil rather than civilized order. These rebellions were costing Rome enormous resources while undermining the psychological warfare that made conquest economically viable. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus of Britain wrote that Boudicca's revolt had gained momentum partly because of stories about arena practices that had reached Celtic tribes through survivors and escaped prisoners. Similar reports came from Germania, where tribal coalitions were forming specifically to prevent their women from suffering the fate that awaited captives in Roman amphitheaters. The empire's most effective tool of intimidation was becoming a recruitment device for its enemies. The military reports reaching Rome painted a terrifying picture for imperial administrators. Rebellion was spreading like wildfire across conquered territories. But this wasn't the usual pattern of isolated uprisings that Roman legions could crush through superior tactics and overwhelming force. These new resistance movements were unified by shared knowledge of what happened to their women in Roman amphitheaters, creating bonds between tribes that had been enemies for centuries. Tacitus recorded fragments of captured correspondence between Germanic chieftains, letters that revealed sophisticated intelligence networks sharing detailed accounts of arena atrocities. Tribal leaders who had never met were coordinating attacks based on their common determination to prevent their daughters from ending up in underground chambers beneath Roman stadiums. The empire's psychological warfare had backfired spectacularly, transforming scattered enemies into a unified force, motivated by protective fury. The economic implications were staggering. Maintaining legions in hostile territories cost exponentially more than governing compliant populations. Each new rebellion required additional troops, extended supply lines, and expensive siege equipment. The treasury officials calculated that suppressing resistance movements inspired by arena practices was consuming resources that could have funded 3 additional legions or constructed 2 more aqueducts. Rome was literally paying for its cruelty through military expenses that threatened imperial solvency. Emperor Titus faced a dilemma that struck at the heart of Roman identity. The gladiator games weren't merely entertainment, but public demonstrations of imperial power that reinforced social hierarchies and political loyalty. Wealthy citizens funded spectacles to curry favor with voters. Politicians promised increasingly elaborate shows to secure election victories. The entire system of Roman democracy depended on bread and circuses, with the circuses specifically designed to remind everyone of their place in the imperial order. Yet continuing these practices was generating military costs that could bankrupt the empire while inspiring coordinated resistance that threatened Roman control over territories that had been pacified for generations. Provincial governors were requesting reinforcements they couldn't afford to send to combat uprisings. They couldn't afford to ignore. The mathematics of empire were simple. Conquest had to generate more revenue than it consumed in maintenance costs, or the entire system would collapse under its own weight. The Senate debates grew increasingly heated as practical concerns clashed with ideological commitments. Senator Marcus Crassus Dives argued that abandoning traditional victory rewards would signal weakness to enemies throughout the known world. Every barbarian king would interpret Roman mercy as Roman decline, encouraging new invasions and rebellions that would ultimately cost far more than current suppression efforts. Strength was the only language barbarians understood, and demonstrating anything less than absolute dominance invited catastrophic miscalculation by potential enemies. Conservative senators produced maps showing the extent of territories under Roman control, pointing out that their ancestors had conquered most of the civilized world precisely because they never showed mercy to defeated enemies. The Carthaginians had been utterly destroyed rather than merely defeated. The Gauls had been enslaved rather than simply conquered. This systematic brutality had created an empire that generated unprecedented wealth and security for Roman citizens. Abandoning proven methods for philosophical experiments risked everything their civilization had achieved. But younger senators, many of whom had served as military commanders in frontier provinces, brought different perspectives to the debate. They had witnessed firsthand how tales of arena atrocities spread through barbarian communities, transforming local disputes into existential struggles against Roman rule. Marcus Tullius Cicero the Younger described meeting with Germanic tribal leaders who spoke more passionately about avenging their violated women than about recovering lost territories or treasure. These practical voices pointed out that Roman military superiority depended on fighting scattered, disorganized enemies who could be defeated in detail through superior tactics and logistics. When barbarian tribes united around common causes, they could field armies large enough to overwhelm even veteran legions. The Teutoburg Forest disaster had demonstrated what happened when Germanic coalitions achieved tactical surprise against isolated Roman forces. Current arena practices were creating the emotional unity necessary for similar coalitions to form across multiple frontiers simultaneously. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of Roman strength. Traditional senators believed power flowed from fear, that enemies submitted only when they understood the terrible consequences of resistance. Modern commanders argued that sustainable dominion required consent, that conquered peoples had to believe Roman rule offered them something better than perpetual rebellion. Fear might win initial victories, but generating lasting loyalty required demonstrating Roman civilization's superiority through justice rather than cruelty. Financial records from the period show the enormous costs associated with maintaining Roman dominance through pure intimidation. Each major gladiator spectacle required hundreds of prisoners, captured through expensive military campaigns that often cost more than the territories they conquered were worth. The logistics of transporting, housing, and processing thousands of captives annually consumed resources that could have been invested in infrastructure projects that would generate long-term economic returns. Arena construction itself represented massive capital investments that produced no economic output beyond entertainment value. The Colosseum had cost the equivalent of building 50 miles of Roman roads or constructing a major aqueduct system. Every amphitheatre throughout the empire required similar expenditures, creating facilities whose sole purpose was consuming human lives for public amusement. From a purely economic perspective, the gladiator system was incredibly inefficient, generating short-term political benefits while imposing long-term fiscal burdens. The medical infrastructure supporting arena operations revealed the industrial scale of Roman brutality. Beneath every major amphitheatre lay networks of specialized facilities staffed by physicians, guards, administrators, and maintenance workers whose sole purpose was processing human suffering. These weren't improvised arrangements, but permanent installations that represented significant ongoing expenses. The empire was essentially maintaining a parallel medical system dedicated to maximizing pain rather than healing injury. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites confirms the systematic nature of these operations. Drainage systems designed to handle large volumes of blood and other fluids, specialized tools crafted specifically for restraining and torturing human beings. Administrative areas where bureaucrats maintained detailed records of prisoner processing storage rooms containing thousands of identification tags, each representing a human life reduced to inventory status. Rome had created an entire industry around dehumanization. The psychological impact on Roman society was becoming increasingly apparent to thoughtful observers. Citizens who regularly attended spectacles where human beings were treated as disposable entertainment were developing attitudes that influenced their behavior in other contexts. Domestic violence increased in neighborhoods surrounding amphitheaters. Merchants reported more frequent disputes with customers who seemed to expect the same absolute submission they witnessed in arena settings. The brutalization of enemies was brutalizing Roman society itself. Military commanders noted declining discipline among troops who had witnessed arena spectacles before deployment. Soldiers who had watched systematic torture and rape being celebrated as entertainment were more likely to commit similar atrocities against civilian populations in conquered territories. This behavior generated additional rebellions while violating military codes designed to maintain order and effectiveness in Roman forces. The arena was teaching Roman citizens to be worse soldiers, worse neighbors, and worse human beings. Seneca wrote privately about the moral corruption he observed among wealthy Romans who funded increasingly elaborate spectacles to demonstrate their generosity and civic spirit. These patrons competed to provide more exotic tortures, more creative humiliations, more shocking violations of human dignity. What had begun as simple execution of criminals had evolved into theatrical productions celebrating every form of cruelty imaginable. The audience's appetite for brutality seemed unlimited, requiring constant escalation to maintain their interest. The religious implications troubled Roman priests who maintained traditional ceremonies honoring the gods. Sacred rituals that had once connected Romans with divine forces were being overshadowed by secular spectacles that glorified human suffering over spiritual transcendence. Young people were abandoning religious festivals to attend gladiator games, suggesting that arena violence was becoming more culturally significant than the worship that supposedly defined Roman civilization. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their home governments about the shocking spectacles they witnessed in Roman amphitheaters. Diplomatic correspondence discovered centuries later reveals that allied kingdoms were reconsidering their relationships with Rome based on horror at arena practices. The Persian ambassador wrote that Romans had become so corrupted by power that they no longer deserved the respect accorded to civilized peoples. Similar sentiments appeared in Egyptian, Syrian, and even Greek diplomatic communications. The intelligence networks that barbarian tribes were developing to share information about Roman arena practices were also being used to coordinate military resistance. Captured documents revealed sophisticated communication systems that allowed tribal leaders separated by hundreds of miles to plan synchronized attacks on Roman positions. The emotional bonds created by shared outrage over arena atrocities were generating practical military cooperation that threatened Roman control across multiple frontiers simultaneously. Economic analysis showed that territories in rebellion consumed vastly more imperial resources than territories under stable Roman administration. A peaceful province might require one legion for security, while generating tax revenues sufficient to fund 3 legions elsewhere. A rebellious province could tie down 4 legions while producing no tax revenue and requiring constant expensive supply operations. The mathematics were clear. Arena practices were transforming profitable territories into financial disasters. The human cost was becoming equally apparent to Roman administrators who maintained detailed population records for tax and military recruitment purposes. Provinces experiencing sustained rebellions were losing population through warfare, refugee migration, and economic disruption. Fewer people meant less tax revenue, fewer potential soldiers, and reduced economic productivity. The empire was literally consuming its own foundation through practices designed to demonstrate imperial power. The crisis that began with one gladiator's refusal to claim his human reward had exposed fundamental contradictions in Roman imperial strategy. The same practices that were supposed to demonstrate Roman strength were undermining the economic and military foundations that made that strength possible. The empire faced a choice between maintaining traditional brutality and adapting to realities that threatened its continued existence. As autumn approached in 79 AD, Emperor Titus found himself confronting a political crisis that could define his reign and determine the empire's future direction. The Senate debates had revealed irreconcilable differences between traditional Roman values and practical imperial necessities. Conservative forces demanded adherence to ancestral customs regardless of consequences, while pragmatic voices insisted that adaptation was essential for survival. The decision he made would echo through centuries of Roman history. The stage was set for a confrontation between two fundamentally different visions of what it meant to be Roman. One side believed strength required absolute dominance over all enemies, including the complete humiliation of conquered peoples. The other argued that true strength lay in creating systems of governance that generated loyalty rather than requiring constant suppression of rebellion. The outcome would determine whether the empire continued down a path of escalating brutality or discovered new methods of maintaining dominion over its vast territories. The underground chambers beneath the Colosseum continued operating according to established procedures while politicians debated their future. Every day brought new captives, new victories, new rewards claimed by gladiators who had earned them through blood and skill. The machine of exploitation continued grinding forward, processing human lives with mechanical efficiency, while the empire struggled to determine whether that machinery remained necessary for imperial survival or had become a threat to everything Rome claimed to represent. The weight of empire pressed down on Rome like the stone ceiling of the Hypogeum itself. While senators debated in marble halls above, the reality of their decisions played out in blood-soaked sand and echoing screams that no amount of political rhetoric could silence. The machine they had built was too vast, too profitable, and too deeply embedded in Roman identity to simply switch off with legislative votes and philosophical arguments. Emperor Titus understood this better than anyone. He had inherited more than a crown from his father Vespasian. He had inherited a system that demanded constant feeding, an apparatus of entertainment that consumed human lives like a furnace consumed wood. The Colosseum alone required thousands of prisoners annually to satisfy the bloodlust of Roman crowds who viewed spectacular death as their birthright. Every province in the empire contained smaller amphitheaters that replicated these horrors on local scales, creating a network of suffering that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. The emperor's private correspondence, discovered in Vatican archives centuries later, reveals the impossible position he faced. Cancel the games entirely and risk massive civil unrest from citizens who expected their bread and circuses continue them unchanged, and watch the empire's frontiers explode in coordinated rebellions that could drain the treasury and destroy Roman military supremacy. There was no clean solution, no path forward that didn't involve enormous costs paid in blood and gold. His advisors presented him with intelligence reports that painted an increasingly desperate picture. Germanic tribes that had been enemies for generations were now sharing weapons, tactics, and strategic information based on their common hatred of Roman arena practices. Celtic druids were preaching holy war against an empire that had turned sacred femininity into public entertainment. Even allied kingdoms were reconsidering their relationships with Rome, disgusted by spectacles that violated fundamental concepts of human dignity recognized across the civilized world. The financial calculations were equally terrifying. The Treasury Secretary's private memoranda documented expenses that threatened imperial solvency. Maintaining legions in hostile territories cost 10 times more than governing peaceful provinces. Each major rebellion required siege equipment, extended supply lines, and mercenary auxiliaries that consumed resources without generating any return. The empire was spending itself into bankruptcy to suppress uprisings caused by entertainment practices that generated no economic value beyond ticket sales. But abandoning the arena system entirely would create different problems that could prove equally catastrophic. The gladiator schools employed thousands of trainers, guards, physicians, and administrators whose livelihoods depended on continued spectacles. The amphitheatres themselves represented massive capital investments that would become worthless without regular events. Entire industries had developed around supplying wild animals, weapons, costumes, and other materials necessary for elaborate shows that Roman citizens now considered essential to civilized life. The political implications cut even deeper. Wealthy Romans gained social status by funding spectacular games that demonstrated their generosity and civic virtue. Ambitious politicians promised increasingly elaborate entertainments to secure votes and maintain popularity. The entire system of Roman democracy had evolved around public displays of wealth and power that required constant supplies of human victims to maintain their effectiveness. Eliminating gladiator rewards would undermine the social mechanisms that kept the empire's ruling class unified and motivated. Titus also faced pressure from the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty depended partly on their privileged access to arena spectacles and associated rewards. These elite soldiers expected entertainment that reflected their special status within Roman society. If the emperor appeared to be weakening traditional Roman values through excessive mercy toward barbarian prisoners, he risked alienating the military forces responsible for protecting his life and maintaining order in the capital itself. The religious establishment added another layer of complexity to the crisis. Traditional Roman ceremonies incorporated gladiator contests as offerings to the gods, particularly during funeral games honoring deceased nobles and military commanders. The priests argued that eliminating these sacred combats would anger divine forces that had blessed Rome with unprecedented prosperity and military success. Abandoning practices sanctified by centuries of tradition might invite catastrophic divine retribution against the entire empire. Foreign policy considerations further complicated any potential reforms. Roman diplomatic strategy relied heavily on intimidation, the assumption that potential enemies would submit rather than risk the terrible fate that awaited those who resisted imperial will. If Rome appeared to be abandoning its reputation for absolute ruthlessness, every barbarian king and rival empire would interpret this as weakness and opportunity. The Parthians, Germans, and other threats would be emboldened to test Roman resolve through military provocations that could spiral into devastating wars. The emperor's personal writings reveal a man torn between conflicting impulses toward mercy and pragmatism. He had witnessed the arena spectacles since childhood, watching his father use increasingly elaborate games to secure political support and demonstrate imperial power. But he had also served as a military commander in Judea, where he had seen firsthand how Roman brutality generated fanatical resistance that prolonged conflicts and multiplied casualties on both sides. His correspondence with provincial governors painted a picture of an empire under increasing strain from rebellions inspired by arena practices. The governor of Gaul reported that Druids were using graphic descriptions of Roman amphitheatre atrocities to unite previously hostile tribes under common leadership. The British commander described Celtic warriors who fought with supernatural fury, preferring death in battle to capture and transport to Roman entertainment venues. Even peaceful provinces were experiencing unrest as stories of arena horrors spread through trade networks and refugee communities. The military reports reaching Rome described enemy tactics that suggested sophisticated understanding of Roman psychological warfare methods. Barbarian forces were deliberately targeting Roman prisoners for torture and mutilation, explicitly citing arena practices as justification for their own brutality. German tribal leaders were reportedly telling their warriors that Romans had forfeited any claim to civilized treatment through their systematic violation of conquered women in entertainment venues. The gladiators' choice that autumn day in 79 AD lit a fuse that would burn through the empire's foundations. Within months, Emperor Titus signed legislation restricting the public display of captive women, marking the first time Rome officially acknowledged limits to its cruelty. Yet the chambers beneath the Colosseum remained, the machine ground on, and thousands more would disappear into that bureaucratic darkness before the empire finally collapsed under the weight of its own brutality. The marble monuments still stand today, tourist attractions hiding archaeological evidence of industrialized suffering that modern excavations continue to uncover. Perhaps the most chilling truth isn't what Rome did to its enemies, but how efficiently it convinced itself that systematic dehumanization was civilization. The blood has long since dried, but the questions remain. How many other buried horrors lie beneath the foundations of empires we celebrate? And when power meets absolute impunity, what separates civilization from sophisticated barbarism? Subscribe for more hidden histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the ancient world.